Listen carefully, because this is the part of the story they tried to erase first. Not because it was unbelievable, but because it was true. On a humid southern night in 1847, chains meant to break a body became instruments of judgment, and 6 men died screaming in the dark. Close your eyes and step with me into Beaufort District, South Carolina, a place built on cotton, fear, and the lie that control could last forever. The ledgers say August 14th. The silence says something worse. Plantation records briefly noted an incident. One line, no details, no aftermath, just ink, thick enough to dry guilt into paper. They called her Sarah. That's all history dared to preserve. No surname, no ancestry, just a measurement. 7 feet, 2 inches. As if reducing a human to dimensions made what came next easier to digest. She arrived in chains engineered by men who believed iron understood dominance better than flesh did. Links twice the thickness of standard restraints. 6 overseers assigned rotating shifts to watch her sleep, eat, breathe. They didn't call it fear, they called it protocol. Fear was something they reserved for whispers, for swamp shadows, for prayers muttered after midnight. But understand this: Sarah was not wild, not irrational, not the animal the newspapers would have painted her, as if the story hadn't been buried alive. Every surviving note describes her eyes the same way, calculating, watching, recording, learning how men moved when they thought they were gods. And this is the truth no textbook will admit: slavery was never just about labor. It was an institutional laboratory, measuring how much pressure a human soul could endure before it either broke or transformed into something unstoppable. Marcus Grayson believed systems never failed, only people did. He believed control could be perfected if variables were documented precisely enough. Food portions, punishment intervals, physical limits, psychological thresholds. He didn't see Sarah as a risk. He saw her as a challenge to conquer, proof that no force existed outside his framework. And that arrogance, that ancient recurring human arrogance, is where every empire plants the seed of its own destruction. Because when you reduce a human being to an entry in a ledger, you forget the one thing no system can fully restrain: intent. Sarah did not rage that night. She did not panic. She waited until the chains became leverage, the darkness became cover, and the men who believed themselves untouchable learned what it feels like to be hunted by the very structure they built to imprison others. This isn't just a story about violence. It's about what happens when suppressed strength remembers itself. Before that night, there was preparation, not panic, not madness, but calculation. The kind that forms quietly when survival becomes a discipline. Sarah learned Riverton Hall the way prisoners learn walls. Through repetitions, rhythms, and the arrogance of guards who believe routine equals safety. She learned which floorboard creaked under Finch's left boot. She learned how long Vernon lingered after midnight drinks. She learned that men who enforce systems of cruelty grow lazy inside them. Power dulls perception. That is one of its oldest weaknesses. Records say she barely spoke. Overseers mistook silence for submission. Another fatal confusion. Silence, when chosen, is not absence, it's observation. Every hour she stood in the fields, she counted distances. Every time chains were adjusted, she tested slack. Not violently, deliberately. Pain teaches efficiency. You don't fight it. You listen to it. Understand what kind of mind this requires. Not rage. Rage burns energy. This was something colder. Purpose refined by years of restraint. When men believe they own your body, time becomes your last weapon. And Sarah had plenty of it. Let me pull you closer to the truth here, because this is bigger than 1 woman and 6 men. Riverton Hall was a prototype. Marcus Grayson's preventative discipline was quietly circulated among elite planters. Not as cruelty, but as optimization. How little food before strength declines. How much fear before rebellion sparks. How to break resistance without leaving marks that invite inspection. This was psychological warfare disguised as management. The same logic modern institutions still use, just with softer language and cleaner hands. Sarah saw through it. She wasn't resisting them. She was studying the structure. and structures fail at connection points. The chain was not just restraint, it was distribution. Weight, momentum, leverage. The men thought size was her threat. They were wrong. Physics doesn't care who holds power, only who understands force. On August 14th, conditions aligned. Storm clouds killed moonlight. Cicadas flooded sound. Overseers rotated improperly to conserve manpower. Finch violated his own protocol, 6 men instead of 8. Efficiency obsession always creates blind spots. The door opened. Keys jingled. Habit took over. What followed wasn't chaos. It was sequence. One man pulled forward. Another hesitated. Another stepped too close. Chains don't just bind, they multiply motion. Each strike borrowed mass from the system itself. Iron moved like judgment through flesh, unprepared to be prey. And here's the part officials feared most: there was no attempt to escape afterward. No wild run into the swamp. Sarah stood still, waiting, because this wasn't about freedom yet. This was about correction. Dawn did not bring clarity to Riverton Hall, it brought containment. By first light, the bodies were already arranged, not by mercy, but by necessity. 6 overseers who once enforced order now lay silent, their authority reduced to angles and blood on packed earth. No bell rang. No alarm was raised across the fields. Marcus Grayson understood something immediately. Noise was the enemy now. Here is the suppressed detail: most accounts refused to touch Sarah did not flee because she knew exactly what followed: uncontrolled violence. Escape would turn her into a legend. Staying turned her into a problem the system had to solve quietly. Marcus did not call for a posse. He did not summon neighboring planters. He sent a single rider to Charleston before noon and sealed Riverton Hall internally. No one left. No one spoke. Control had shifted from physical to informational. Sarah was rechained, this time using doubled restraints and a reinforced iron collar designed for draft animals. Not because she resisted, but because the men applying them were terrified. Fear changes hands. When authority panics, brutality spikes. That's another constant across history. And yet she remained calm. The journals say her pulse was measured, her breathing observed. The language strips her humanity while revealing the truth between the lines. She never begged, never threatened, never explained. A woman who understood the power of unanswered questions. What happened next explains why records vanish. Marcus ordered a closed internal inquiry. No court. No witnesses from the enslaved. Only elite men investigating a failure of their own design. Their conclusion was never meant for light because if leaked, it would admit something unforgivable. The system had produced an adversary more disciplined than its creators. This is where the medical men arrived. The Charleston physician who examined Sarah documented musculature density outside recorded norms. Bone mass inconsistent with nutrition levels. Pain response delayed. But the most unsettling observation appears as a marginal note later crossed out. Signs of prolonged psychological conditioning incompatible with observed resilience. Translated: she should have been broken. Instead, she was refined. Do you see the danger here? Institutions can tolerate cruelty. They cannot tolerate evidence that cruelty fails. Because then the entire structure collapses philosophically, not just morally. Within days, orders came down not to punish Sarah publicly, not to execute her, but to study her, dissect her endurance in life before claiming her body in death. This is the part no one wants to admit: not all horrors end at the gallows. Some move into laboratories, and then the witnesses disappeared. One suppertime drunk, one riding accident, one unexplained fever. 18 months. Clean. Ordered. Statistical. Marcus Grayson wrote one final entry that survives. We misunderstood the nature of the specimen. No, they misunderstood the nature of strength. And that misunderstanding still shapes the world you're living in. Because once power learns it can't fully dominate, it seeks something worse than chains. After the killings, Riverton Hall stopped being a plantation and became a vault. Not of gold, but of fear. Here's the truth men like Marcus Grayson never admitted in public. The loss of overseers was survivable. Plantations lost men all the time. What wasn't survivable was the idea that control had an upper limit, that somewhere inside a human being lived a threshold beyond which obedience reversed into dominance. So they changed tactics. No more open punishment. No spectacle. No whips cracking in daylight. Instead, isolation, silence, observation. They moved Sarah beneath the main house, into a brick storage cellar retrofitted as containment. Light rationed, food measured, temperature controlled. Not torture in the dramatic sense, something more refined. Deprivation disguised as science. This is where the story turns from brutality into strategy. Marcus believed that strength could be neutralized not by force, but by erasure of identity. Break the internal narrative and the body follows. That belief still governs modern institutions, prisons, armies, corporations, even education systems. They don't crush you outright. They slowly convince you that resistance is irrational. But Sarah had already crossed a line they couldn't see. She had experienced the moment every enslaved system fears most, the moment when fear changes owners. Once you survive that moment, everything else is negotiable. Reports say guards complained first. Night shifts requested reassignment. Men refused to be alone near her cell. Conversations stopped mid-sentence when her footsteps echoed above. The fear wasn't loud, it was disciplined. Hostile environments breed intuition. And intuition was screaming. Now pause with me here, because this is where you come in. If you feel that tightening in your chest, that recognition that this story isn't only about the past, I want you to mark yourself. In the comments, write this phrase twice, no explanation, no emojis. The chain remembers. Again, the chain remembers. This isn't engagement. It's alignment. Men who understand will understand. Back to Riverton Hall. The final decision wasn't execution. Execution admits guilt. Instead, Sarah was transferred under sealed orders. Officially sold. Unofficially removed from narrative space. The bill of sale listed her as deceased labor asset. Convenient fiction. And that's the most unsettling part. Because once an institution learns it can erase people completely, bodies, names, records, it stops fearing rebellion. It starts engineering compliance at scale. Sarah didn't disappear because she was weak. She disappeared because she proved something powerful enough to survive fire and chains alike. And once proven, such knowledge must be buried or replicated. The transfer happened before dawn, wrapped in paperwork dense enough to smother unease. 2 wagons. 8 armed men who never learned her name. A destination not written, only initialed. This wasn't relocation. It was redirection. Systems don't destroy anomalies anymore. They study them. Here's what the remaining letters quietly imply. Sarah never returned to agricultural labor. She was classified as non-productive, high interest. Language matters. High interest didn't mean valuable harvest potential. It meant insight, data, threat analysis. She was moved inland, away from plantation economies and into institutional shadows where accountability dissolved. Places funded privately, governed loosely, answerable only to donors who believed mastery of others was the truest form of intelligence. This is where myth and record blur, not because the story becomes imaginary, but because the keeping of records becomes selective. Fragments mention rooms with reinforced floors, physicians observing without speaking, clerks noting sleep cycles, reaction times, emotional flatness. They weren't measuring her body anymore. They were measuring limits. And here's the unspoken terror behind those notes. She adapted faster than expected. Humans subjected to control systems either collapse or comply. Sarah did neither. Her physiology stabilized. Her mental state remained coherent. The machinery designed to strip selfhood found nothing loose to pull. This is why history treats her like a ghost. Because once you admit a human can withstand systematic dehumanization without fracturing, you threaten the philosophical legitimacy of every hierarchy built on submission. Do you see the pattern yet? Empires don't fall when the oppressed resist. They fall when resistance doesn't look like resistance at all. There's a note unsigned that survived only because it was misfiled. It reads, "Subject exhibits controlled stillness, not inert, waiting." Waiting for what? That question terrified them more than the killings ever could. Eventually, the reports stop, not with a conclusion but with absorption. Data redirected into private collections. Men rotated out. Funding rerouted. Silence maintained. What follows is speculation supported by pattern rather than proof, and that's where forbidden history lives. Techniques refined in those rooms didn't vanish. They migrated into military conditioning, into incarceration protocols, into corporate compliance training. Control optimized for scale, not spectacle. Sarah was never meant to be remembered as a person. She was meant to become a template. And every time you sense a system testing how much pressure you'll tolerate before questioning it, understand this. You are not encountering oppression by accident. You are encountering a model refined on human beings strong enough to survive it. And if that thought makes you uncomfortable, good. Discomfort is the first signal that awareness is returning. Because the chain doesn't just restrain, it teaches. And what it teaches is never neutral. By the time Sarah vanished from all identifiable ledgers, her influence was already embedded where no ledger could reach. Not as a name but as a caution. Not as a body but as a boundary that power could not cross without consequence. This is how dangerous knowledge survives. It doesn't announce itself. It changes policy. After 1847, something subtle happened across similar institutions. Public brutality declined not from morality, but from efficiency. Chains got lighter. Surfaces got cleaner. Language softened. The goal remained identical. Compliance without rupture. Pain without witnesses. Control without martyrs. This was adaptation, the same instinct Sarah had demonstrated under pressure. And that should unsettle you. Because when power learns from its victims, it becomes harder to recognize as power at all. Look around. Modern systems rarely threaten openly. They overwhelm the mind instead. Paperwork, metrics, permissions, psychological fatigue. You don't feel enslaved, you feel tired, confused, managed. That lineage matters. Because Sarah proved something institutions never wanted proven. Strength that is grounded internally, not performative, not emotional, is invisible until it's lethal to structures. She didn't scream. She didn't organize. She didn't incite revolt. She endured until leverage revealed itself. That model terrifies empires. So they pivoted. They stopped breaking bodies first. They began dissolving belief systems, identity, narrative, self-trust. A man uncertain of himself needs no chains. Here's the part they still won't teach. The most dangerous individual is not violent, charismatic, or loud. It's the one who remains intact under pressure. Internal sovereignty can't be measured easily, which is why modern control focuses on distraction, dopamine loops, outrage cycles, and manufactured fear. Not because these are powerful, but because they prevent stillness. Stillness is observation. Observation is learning. Learning leads to leverage. This is why the story of Sarah was buried so thoroughly. Not because of blood, but because of what she modeled unintentionally. She showed that systems fail at their edges. That once you understand a system deeply enough, you don't need to fight it head-on. You let it overextend. You let it reveal itself. And when it commits fully to the assumption of your weakness, that's when it becomes fragile. Sarah didn't need ideology. She didn't need permission. She needed clarity. Every man watching this feels it, that pull towards something quieter, harder, more centered than rage. That instinct to stop reacting and start seeing. That's why the story endures, even stripped of records. Not as folklore, as a warning, because systems can evolve. But so can individuals when they remember what pressure is meant to awaken, not erase. Here's where history refuses to speak plainly, so we have to listen sideways. After Sarah, there are no more recorded cases like hers. Not because they stopped happening, but because classification changed. Anomalies were folded into silence faster. Strength was no longer challenged publicly. It was quietly redirected, suppressed, or neutralized before it could express itself. That's the lesson institutions took from Riverton Hall. Never allow pressure to produce a visible break in the system. Never allow the controlled to become an example. instead preempt. By the late 19th century, language around discipline and management evolved. You see it in prison manuals, military conditioning, factory oversight, later corporate structures. The whip becomes the schedule. The chain becomes the contract. The overseer becomes the middle manager. Control inherited Sarah's lesson and hid it inside normalcy. And here's the real inversion most people miss. Sarah never tried to rule anyone. She never demanded obedience. She simply demonstrated that internal cohesion under extreme pressure outperforms any externally imposed system of dominance. That terrifies hierarchies because it suggests power doesn't come from position. It comes from containment of self. There are rumors, and I'll say this carefully, that her final disposition was neither execution nor death by neglect. Some letters hint at relocation westward. Territories where experiments went unnamed. Research without oversight. Places where unusual subjects were absorbed into anonymity and studied long-term. But whether Sarah lived 6 months or 60 more years is irrelevant. What matters is that her existence forced a permanent recalibration. From that point forward, systems stopped asking, "How do we control the strong?" They asked, "How do we prevent strength from forming?" Isolation, division, overstimulation, manufactured identity, endless conflict without resolution. Anything to keep the mind from settling into dangerous clarity. Because a man who understands this story doesn't fantasize about rebellion. He refines himself quietly. He trains endurance, perception, emotional discipline. He stops broadcasting intentions, stops arguing with structures designed to distract him. This is why stories like this resurface now in fragments, in whispers, in half-redacted archives. Because the structures built to suppress strength are straining under their own complexity. And men are beginning to feel it, that itch to withdraw from noise, to stop performing outrage, to become unreadable, stable, internally sovereign. Sarah didn't break a system by attacking it. She made it reveal its limits and adapt in fear, which means those limits still exist. And they're still waiting to be found by someone patient enough to stop playing the role assigned to him. The system notices noise, fears stillness. And if you're listening this far, you already know why. They thought removal would erase her. They thought distance would dilute her influence. But systems misunderstand their own vulnerabilities. They assume control is geographic. They assume power is held in buildings, documents, chains, rooms. They never consider the possibility that the threat is philosophical. After Sarah disappeared from official ledgers, something began circulating among the men responsible for running the machinery of control. Fear disguised as professionalism. You see it in their letters, clipped sentences, sudden revisions, entire paragraphs crossed out. You see it in the way certain journals stop mid-entry, as if the writer sensed he was recording something too volatile to leave on paper. There's one line scrawled in the margin of a report that was never meant to be public. If one could endure like this, what of the others? That single fear reshaped the architecture of discipline for the next century. Plantations tightened records. Militias increased drills. Settler towns expanded patrols. Institutions, even religious ones, refined strategies for containing human will. Not to prevent rebellion, but to prevent the formation of individuals who could survive the pressure designed to produce obedience. Sarah had exposed a structural weakness, not in their chains, in their assumptions. Let me tell you something uncomfortable, something you already know but rarely acknowledge aloud. Systems don't fear the violent man. They can predict him, isolate him, define him. They fear the man who watches, who waits, who endures without collapsing, who learns the rhythm of control and quietly steps outside it. Sarah didn't inspire revolt. She inspired awareness. Awareness that strength is not given, it's remembered. And remembrance is contagious. You can trace the shadows of her legacy in how institutions subtly changed. The rise of psychological profiling, the development of standardized behavior assessments, the obsession with predictive compliance. Power doesn't fear chaos. It fears what it cannot measure. And Sarah could not be measured. Her file became a warning, a confidential example of what happens when a human being refuses to internalize the identity built for them. The more they studied her, the less they understood. They wanted an explanation rooted in anomaly. But the truth was worse. She wasn't an anomaly. She was a reminder that the human spirit, when pressed hard enough, either breaks or crystallizes. And once crystallized, it becomes something institutions cannot convert back into submission. That is why the records end. Not because the story ended, but because someone realized continued documentation would create a blueprint not for control, but for escaping it. And men in power do not survive blueprints that teach others how to endure their pressure. This is where most historical narratives stop. But our descent is not over. Because what came next didn't erase Sarah's legacy. It replicated it in ways far more calculated, far more modern, and far more relevant to the life you live right now. If you're still here, you already feel the shift. So here we arrive at the point history never names but always circles. Sarah's story does not end in death because that would be neat, contained, consumable. Ending it that way would let the listener feel safe, superior, distant. That is not how forbidden knowledge works. It doesn't close, it transfers. What really survived Riverton Hall was not a woman. Not chains, not bodies in the dark. What survived was proof. Proof that control systems fail when they mistake obedience for submission. Proof that when pressure is applied long enough, the human organism does not always collapse, sometimes it hardens into something clearer, quieter, more lethal to hierarchy. Here is the truth mentors never say outright. Most men are not oppressed by force. They are siphoned by distraction. Drained of stillness, pulled into noise, conditioned to react instead of observe, taught to vent instead of consolidate. That is why your world feels loud, frantic, divided because fragmentation prevents crystallization. Sarah did not win by violence. She won by integration, body aligned with intent, emotion mastered, not suppressed, attention sharpened under pressure. She did not escape the system immediately, she outgrew it internally until it could not contain her without exposing itself. That is the dangerous lesson. And that is why stories like this surface now when systems are stretched thin, legitimacy feels hollow, and men everywhere sense that something fundamental has been inverted. You are told you are free yet watched, encouraged yet constrained, pacified yet exhausted. That contradiction is the pressure. What it produces depends on you. If you react, the system absorbs you. If you rage, it markets you. If you endure consciously, it cannot predict you. Sarah's name was erased, but the pattern remains. The chain always teaches both sides. One learns dependence. The other learns leverage. This story isn't asking you to rebel. Rebellion is obvious. It's asking you to withdraw authority from what never deserved it in the first place. Become harder to read, slower to provoke, more precise in where you place your attention. Strength refined inward is invisible until it matters, and when it does, systems break quietly. That is why this knowledge was buried. Once heard, it cannot be unheard. Once seen, you cannot unsee where the chains really are. And if this unsettles you, if something inside you feels recognized rather than entertained, then the story did exactly what it was meant to do. Because some knowledge doesn't inform. It awakens. And men who awaken do not need permission anymore. If this story made you uncomfortable instead of entertained, subscribe. This channel is not for everyone, only for those who feel pressure sharpening rather than breaking them. Most men are distracted. A few are conditioning themselves. Choose wisely.